further ado, I'm going to introduce our last speaker before our lunch break. If you guys want travel hacking or to save money on flights, here's your guy. Come on up.
Thanks, Johnny. I should probably introduce myself, and I should probably tell you that I'm a flight hacker. I also sell greeting cards, and I also dropship products, and I write about all of it for fun online. But instead, what I'd rather do is I'd rather tell a story, and it's not my story, but it's a story that's going to teach a couple fundamental principles about competition. And so in the story, we're going to look at one of the most competitive businessmen who has ever lived, and we're going to dissect a couple of the big moves that he makes over his lifetime. And this man's name is Cornelius Vanderbilt. You may have heard of him. So Cornelius is born on May 27th in 1794, and he's born in Port Richmond, which is a tiny village on Staten Island in New York. And of course, New Yorkers that are born at the end of the 18th century or the beginning of the 19th century can be divided into two categories. The first one are New Yorkers that would go on to be wealthy industrialists, and the second are those who would serve those who would go on to become wealthy industrialists. So Cornelius is born starkly on one end of the spectrum, but he finishes his life wholly on the other. And, he's a New Yorker, of course, so I mean that in the fullest sense of the word. Cornelius is crude and stubborn and forthright, and he has an extraordinary ego, and he rarely looks away from his work, and he dresses stiffly, and he has a long white mane, and he drinks heavily, and he has very strong feelings about the war. But most importantly, and what we're going to focus on, is that Cornelius is a ruthless competitor. Right? So at the age of 11, Cornelius drops out of school, and he starts working on a ferry, and he's transporting passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. And at the age of 16, he actually borrows $100 from his parents in order to buy his own ship so that he can operate on the same route. And Cornelius becomes so enamored of the concept of moving people and cargo from place to place that his peers begin calling him Commodore. So as soon as Commodore has his new ship, he slashes the price and begins stealing passengers from his former employers. He's stealing the money directly out of their pockets, much to their dismay. This is how Cornelius would do his business. So fast forward a little bit, in the mid-1800s, you need to know that shipping is a very lucrative industry. And so there's no shortage of young Commodores who are buying up ferries and cargo ships because they want to build a shipping empire. However, out of all of them that will try, only Commodore will truly build an empire. And contrary to the rest of them, he'll actually take an extremely short amount of time to do it. See, an increasing amount of the cargo that's being moved at this time in the mid-1800s is going from the earlier developed eastern cities of New York and Boston to the boom spurring out of the California gold rush, right? And at the same time, because of the geographic enormity that exists between the US Northeast and California, there's 3 transportation options available to get there. So the first one is the obvious one, and because steamships were the primary method of cargo transport, it was the one that everyone used for many years, and that is that you would circumnavigate Cape Horn, way at the bottom of South America, and then continue up the western coast of Chile to California. Conventional vessels that did this route took 159 days to do it. It took 5 months for them to make that trip from New York to California. And then when faster vessels were invented, these so-called clipper ships, they could do the route in a mere 90 days, 3 months. But because these ships were designed for speed and not for cargo, the ride became prohibitively expensive for almost everyone. So there has to be a better way. Number 1 doesn't make sense. So we move on to number 2, and that's land transit. Well, land transit doesn't really make sense either. It means that you have to navigate a great many innavigable roads that seem to take passengers the longest route possible to get from New York to California. It simply doesn't make sense either. So we moved to option 3, and this is what the prevailing steamship operators had settled upon in order to get to California, and that is portaging across Central America. Now, as you can imagine, in order to get an entire steamship worth of passengers and cargo over land, it's a very laborious process. You know, you have to unload the ship on the Atlantic side, move all of the passengers and cargo across Central America, and then you have to reload the ship on the Pacific coast and set it off to California. So, in order to figure out the best place in Central America to do this, dozens of New York companies were sending scouts down to Central America to figure out where is the best place to make this crossing. And so, you know, hundreds, thousands of people went down to Central America, and they talked with locals, and they learned the local geography, and what they learned, and they all came back to New York, and they all said, without fail, Panama. The best place to cross is in Panama. So they all crossed in Panama. But Commodore, who's now one of the wealthiest steamship operators in New York, he's not so easily placated. See, Commodore is sitting in his study one day, and he's reading, and he shouts aloud to himself, I've got it! I've solved the problem. I've figured out a better way to get to California. And see, Commodore has been studying intensively some maps of Central America, and he's noticed something that everyone else has overlooked. He notices a river. It's a tiny river, too insignificant for anyone else to blink an eye at, but it's still a river nonetheless, and it's called the Rio San Juan. It runs from the eastern shores of Nicaragua in a relatively direct path into Lake Nicaragua. And then from the western shores of Lake Nicaragua, there's only 20 kilometers of land between there and the Pacific Ocean. So Commodore starts thinking about going through Nicaragua. You know, everyone else that's thought about it has either said, well, the Rio San Juan is too narrow, the Nicaraguan government is too unstable, or, you know, simply the stakes are too high. But none of these deter Commodore. This is what he does. He goes down to Nicaragua 3 times personally. He clears the Rio San Juan of all obstacles. He personally, he leads the team that builds ships of unrivaled speed and fuel efficiency, like ships we've never seen before. And then he erects a road from the western shores of Lake Nicaragua into San Juan del Sur, which is his port on the Pacific coast. And he does all of this within 12 months. And so now with his new route, which is a huge, huge development in shipping at the time, with his new route, he's able to compete directly with the other players, but he has a much better product, right? So this is the first lesson that we learned from Commodore, which is that regardless of how established your competition is, with a bit of creativity, you can always, always win the battle. And this is a battle that he definitely won. The prevailing price for the route from New York to California was $600. As soon as Commodore enters with his new route, he slashes the price to $400. And within a year of operating on that route, he continually slashes the price until it reaches just $150, 1/4 of what everyone else is charging. His route is also 800 kilometers shorter and takes between 2 and 7 days less, which is a huge development at the time. So he's clearly winning this battle. But here's the problem. The problem is that his 2 rival steamship companies actually have something that Commodore will never achieve, and that's government subsidies. See, with all of the people moving to California for the gold rush, an increasing amount of mail is all of a sudden moving there as well. And the United States government can't build the infrastructure fast enough to deliver that mail. So what do? They turn to private enterprise. And they look to 2 companies, 2 of the 3 biggest companies that were operating on this route alongside Commodore. They are the US Mail Steamship Company and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. And they begin to offer those 2 companies a massive subsidy to bring the mail. So Commodore's first competitive tactic doesn't work. He tries to bleed them by offering such a far lower rate, but then the government steps in and says, no, we're going to ensure that you guys survive. So Commodore does something again. He really wants these guys out of the market. And so what he does is he offers to deliver the mail for free. He says, I'm going to take all of your mail, all of the United States mail from New York, all the way through Nicaragua into California for free, but the government says no. Right? This is the government we're dealing with. The government says no, which is absurd. And instead, what actually happens is the US Mail Steamship Company and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company actually appeal for a greater subsidy because they can't compete with Commodore. They know that. He's stealing all their passengers. They can't compete with Commodore, so they ask for a bigger subsidy. And this time, of course, the United States government approves it. So now it's Commodore who has his hands tied. He's tried every trick that he has. You know, he's trying to dominate this market, but the US government is just pushing money into his competitors. So what can he do? Well, he sells all of his ships, every last one of them, and he puts his entire fortune into railroads. And unfortunately, that is the tragic finish to Commodore's career in the steamship industry. But why do we talk about Commodore? You know, there's a couple of key reasons. We live today in a world where there's lots and lots and lots of competition. You know, high schoolers are competing to get into the best universities, university graduates are competing for the best jobs, employees are competing for the best promotions. It goes on and on. As entrepreneurs, we readily dive into markets riddled with competition because we're brought up to believe that, you know, if you compete in a market and win, that's something to be proud of. And even on a primal level, men compete for the best women and women compete for the best men. So obviously, this is deeply rooted within us, right? Well, our competitive guy, Commodore, actually disagrees. And he's seen for a very long time, since the time when he was 16 years old and he bought his first ship, he's seen that there's a wide divide between competing and winning. They're two completely independent actions to him, right? Competing is about, it means that you're expending effort in defeating someone else, in defeating an opponent. Winning does not. You don't need to expend effort to beat someone else to win, necessarily. But to compete, you do. And this brings us to a really interesting apex in how Commodore is running his companies relative to everyone else, right? This seems to be the story of an ultra-competitive man who just jumps into a market and competes. But no, it's not at all. It's actually the story of a man who is interested only in monopolies. He doesn't want to compete in a market, so when he jumps into that market, he either wins it completely or he doesn't play at all. This is a guy that is not ready to push resources and value of his into battling other people. He wants to offer all of his value just to his customers in a one-on-one exchange. So instead of the classic competitive tactics that his competitors or his opponents are actually employing, he follows more of a higher level business strategy. And it comes in 3 points. The first is build something uniquely valuable. The second is don't give others a chance to compete with you. And the third is constantly add more value so that your customers never want to leave. I think we're all well versed in number one, build something uniquely valuable. We're all building different things here. But when it comes to numbers 2 and 3, I think it's important to ask, what are you doing specifically to ensure that no one can compete with you? Are you creating a market of your own? Or are you just simply jumping into someone else's market and trying to elbow your way in? And finally, constantly add more value so your customers, once you build that monopoly, you can keep adding more and more and more. To give your customers absolutely zero reason to even look left or right, they're always looking directly at you because you are their service provider. But this actually brings up something, an enormously important detail that I skipped over when I was talking about, when Commodore left the shipping industry. And that's this. When the US Mail Steamship Company and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company appealed for an even greater subsidy, it seems as though Commodore simply crumbled. He said, I can't compete with this, so I'm going to be out. I'm leaving the industry altogether. But instead, what happened is he turned their advantage into his own advantage. See, behind the scenes, Commodore actually met with the US Mail Steamship Company and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. And when he met with them, he said, you're going to give me a sum of $672,000 per year, which at the time is approximately 1% of the entire United States federal budget. So we're talking huge, huge money here. You're going to give me $672,000 a year to keep my ships at port. And you know what? That's exactly what they did. That's exactly what they did. You talk about a hands-off business, that is a hands-off business. Right? So it's clear that, on one side, we show that Commodore can get into any battle and win any battle that he wants to if it's business on business, mano a mano. But when government steps in, it makes it impossible for an equal-footed business versus business battle. Well, then Commodore is going to take a step back and he says, I'm going to surrender this battle, but I'm still going to win this war. Right? So he definitely won the war when he's getting such a huge amount of money for doing absolutely nothing. And that's actually the reason that he sold his ships and moved into railroads. But I think the most important thing that we can learn from Commodore, it's a lesson that we all know already. We've already internalized it. It's one that's timeless. It's just as important today as it will be tomorrow. And I think it's one that you can really look back to when you have maybe your next big business decision or your next major life decision. And it's simply this, it's Commodore through and through. It's that sometimes the winning strategy is to not compete at all. And for that, we owe Commodore a great vote of thanks. Thank you. So Johnny asks, where can you find me? I chose not to talk about my own business today because I thought these are timeless principles that can be applied forever. But if you do want to look up my flight hacking, which I'm doing, I'm sending people around the world every day. My website is called Your Oyster, as in the world is your oyster. It's spelled Y-O-R-E, oyster.com. That's where I operate from.
Thank you, guys.